All right, get excited. I'm going to read now the letter I guess Samuel James wrote to Mr. Cave for some reason. I don't remember why. To Mr. Caves, November 25th, 1734. Sir, as you appear no less sensible than your readers of the defects of your poetical article, you will not be displeased if, in order to be the improvement of it, I communicate to you the sentiments of a person who will undertake, on reasonable terms, sometimes to fill a column. His opinion is that the public would not give you a bad reception if, besides the current wit of the month, which a critical examination would generally reduce to a narrow compass, you omitted not only poems, inscriptions, etc., never printed before, which he will sometimes supply you with, but likewise short literary dissertations in Latin or English, critical remarks on authors ancient or modern, forgotten poems that deserve revival, or loose pieces like Floyer's, worth preserving. Note here, Sir John Floyer's Treatise on Cold Baths. By this method, your literary article, for it might be called, will, he thinks, be better recommended to the public than by low jests, awkward buffoonery, or the dull scurrilities of either party. If such a correspondence will be agreeable to you, be pleased to inform me in 2 posts what the conditions are on which you shall expect it. Your late offer, footnote here, a prize of £50 for the best poem of life, death, judgment, heaven, and hell, gives me no reason to distrust your generosity. If you engage in any literary projects besides this paper, I have other designs to impart, if I could be secure from having others reap the vantage of what I should hint. Your letter, by being directed to S. Smith, to be left at the castle in Birmingham, Warwickshire, will reach your humble servant. End of letter. Mr. Cave has put a note on this letter, answered December 2nd, but whether anything was done in consequence of it, we are not informed. So that was Johnson trying to get some kind of column in a paper or something, I guess. Johnson had, from his early youth, been sensible to the influence of female charms. When at Stourbridge School, he was much enamored of Olivia Lloyd, a young Quaker, to whom he wrote a copy of verses, which I have not been able to recover. But with what facility and elegance he could warble the amorous lay will appear from the following lines which he wrote for his friend Mr. Edmund Hector. Verses to a lady on receiving from her a sprig of myrtle. What hopes, what terrors does thy gift create? Ambiguous emblem of uncertain fate. The myrtle, ensign of supreme command, consigned by Venus to Melissa's hand. Not less capricious than a reigning fair, now grants and now rejects a lover's prayer. In myrtle shades oft sings the happy swain, in myrtle shades despairing ghosts complain. The myrtle crowns the happy lovers' heads, the unhappy lovers' grave the myrtle spreads. Oh, then the meaning of thy gift impart, and ease the throbbings of an anxious heart. Soon must this bow, as you shall fix his doom, adorn Philander's head, or grace his tomb. And now I will read you a very long footnote on this page. Let me just show you how long it is. There's the end of the poem right there. And the rest of this page is all a footnote, which I'm going to read to you right now. Here we go. Oh, actually, it looks like this footnote even continues on the next page. Oh, boy. All right, here we go. This is about that poem. Mrs. Piazzi gave the following account of this little composition from Dr. Johnson's own relation to her, on her inquiring whether it was rightly attributed to him. Quotes from her. I think it is now just 40 years ago that a young fellow had a sprig of myrtle given him by a girl he courted, and asked me to write him some... Oh, this is Johnson, I'm sorry. And asked me to write some verses that he might present her in return. I promised, but forgot. And when he called for his lines at the time agreed on, sit still a moment, says I, dear Mund, and I'll fetch them thee. So steps aside for 5 minutes, and wrote the nonsense you now see such a stir about. Anecdote, page 34. So he promised to write this guy a love poem, forgot, then was like, when the guy came for it, he was like, hold on a second, let me get it, and then he wrote something. In my first edition, I was induced to doubt the authenticity of this account by the following circumstantial statements in a letter to me from Miss Seward of Lichfield. I know these verses were addressed to Lucy Porter, when he was enamored of her in his boyish days 2 or 3 years before he had seen her mother, his future wife. Weird. He wrote them at my grandfather's, and gave them to Lucy in the presence of my mother, to whom he showed them on the instant. She used to repeat them to me when I asked her for the verses Don Johnson... I'm sorry. The verses Dr. Johnson gave her on the sprig of myrtle, which he had stolen or begged from her bosom. We all know honest Lucy Porter to have been capable of the mean vanity of applying to herself compliment not intended for her. Such was this lady's statement, which I make no doubt she supposed to be correct. But it shows how dangerous it is to trust too implicitly to traditional testimony and ingenious inference. For Mr. Hector has lately assured me that Mrs. Piozzi's account is in this instance accurate, and that he was the person for whom Johnson wrote these verses, which have been erroneously ascribed to Mr. Hammond. So in that account, before I go on, if I'm reading this correctly, Johnson, not Don Johnson, Dr. Johnson, wrote that poem for Lucy Porter, and then I guess later in his life he married Lucy's mother, which I don't know about. Okay. I am obliged in so many instances to notice Mrs. Piozzi's incorrectness of relation that I gladly seize this opportunity of acknowledging that, however often, she is not always inaccurate. The author, having been drawn into a controversy with Miss Anna Seward, in consequence of the preceding statement, which may be found in the Gentleman Magazine, volume LIII, I don't know what number that is, received the following letter from Mr. Edmund Hector on the subject. Dear Sir, I am sorry to see you are engaged in altercation with a lady who seems unwilling to be convinced of her errors. Surely it would be more ingenious to acknowledge than to persevere. Lately, in looking over some papers I meant to burn, I found the original manuscript of the Myrtle, with the date on it 1731, which I have enclosed. The true history, which I could swear to, is as follows. Mr. Morgan Graves, the elder brother of a worthy clergyman near Bath, with whom I was acquainted, waited until a lady in the neighborhood, who at parting presented him the branch. He waited upon her. He showed it to me, and wished much to return the compliment in verse. I applied to Johnson, who was with me, and in about half an hour dictated the verse which I sent to my friend. I most solemnly declare, at that time Johnson was an entire stranger to the Porter family, and it was almost 2 years after that I introduced him to the acquaintance of Porter, whom I bought my clothes of. If you can intend to convince this obstinate woman, and to exhibit to the public the truth of your narrative, you are at liberty to make what use you please of this statement. I hope you will pardon me for taking up so much of your time. Wishing you multos et felicites annos, many years and happy ones. I shall subscribe, your obliged humble servant, E. Hector. Birmingham, January 9th, 1794. All right, back to the, that's the end of that footnote. That took a while, huh? Back to the story at hand now. Ooh. His juvenile attachments to the fair sex were, however, very transient. And it is certain that he found no criminal connection whatsoever. I mean, sex. Mr. Hector, who lived with him in his younger days, in the utmost intimacy and social freedom, has assured me that even at that ardent season his conduct was strictly virtuous in this respect, and that though he loved to exhilarate himself with wine, he never knew him intoxicated but once. And a man whom religion and education has secured from licentious indulgences the passion of love, when once it has seized him, is exceedingly strong. Being unimpaired by dissipation and totally concentrated in one object. This was experienced by Johnson when he became the fervent admirer of Mrs. Porter after her first husband's death. Miss Porter told me that when he was first introduced to her mother, his appearance was very forbidding. He was then lean and lank, so that his immense structure of bones was hideously striking to the eye, and the scars of the scrofula was deeply visible. He also wore his hair, which was straight and stiff, and separated behind, and he often had, seemingly, convulsive starts and odd gesticulations, which tended to excite at once surprise and ridicule. Mrs. Porter was so much engaged by his conversation that she overlooked all these external disadvantages and said to her daughter, "This is the most sensible man that I ever saw in my life." Though Mrs. Porter was double the age of Johnson, she was born in February 4th, 1688, and her person and manner, as described to me and by the late Mr. Garrick, were by no means pleasing to others. She must have been a superiority of understanding and talents, as she certainly inspired him with a more than ordinary passion. And she having signified her willingness to accept of his hand, he went to Lichfield to ask his mother's consent to the marriage, which he could not but be conscious was a very imprudent scheme, both on account of their disparity of years and her want of fortune. But Mrs. Johnson knew too well the ardor of her son's temper, and was too tender a parent to oppose his inclinations. Oh, that's right. His father had died already. That's why he's going to his mother. I know not for what reason the marriage ceremony was not performed at Birmingham, but a resolution was taken that it should be at Derby, for which place the bride and bridegroom set out on horseback, I suppose, in very good humor. But though Mr. Topham Beauclerk used archly to mention Johnson having told him, with much gravity, "Sir, it was a love marriage upon both sides," I have had from my illustrious friend the following curious account of their journey to church upon the nuptial morn. 9th July. Sir, she had read the old romances, and had got into her head the fantastical notion that a woman of spirit should use her lover like a dog. So, sir, at first she told me that I rode too fast, and she could not keep up with me, and when I rode a little slower she passed me and complained that I lagged behind. I was not to be made the slave of caprice, and I resolved to begin as I meant to end. I therefore pushed on briskly, till I was fairly out of her sight. The road lay between two hedges, so I was sure that she could not miss it, and I contrived that she should soon come up with me. When she did, I observed her to be in tears. This, it must be allowed, was a singular beginning of connubial felicity. Connubial felicity. But there was no doubt that Johnson, though he thus showed a manly firmness, proved a most affectionate and indulgent husband to the last moments of Mrs. Johnson's life. And in his prayers and meditations, we find very remarkable evidence that his regard and fondness for her never ceased, even after her death. He now set up a private academy, for which purpose he hired a large house, well situated near his native city. In the Gentleman's Magazine for 1736, there is the following advertisement. At Edial, near Lichfield in Staffordshire, young gentlemen are boarded and taught the Latin and Greek languages by Samuel Johnson. I don't know how he got going on that direction. But the only pupils that were put under his care were the celebrated David Garrick and his brother George, and a Mr. Offley, a young gentleman of good fortune who died early. As yet, his name has nothing of that celebrity which afterwards commanded the highest attention and respect of mankind. Of mankind! Had such an advertisement appeared after the publication of his London, or his Rambler, or his Dictionary, how would it have burst upon the world? With what eagerness would be great, and the wealthy have embraced an opportunity of putting their sons under the learned tuition of Samuel Johnson. The truth, however, is that he was not so well qualified for being a teacher of elements, and a conductor in learning by regular gradations as men of inferior powers of mind. Yeah, I didn't have like a teaching license or anything, right? His own acquisitions had been made by fits and starts, by violent interruptions into the regions of knowledge. It could not be expected that his impatience would be subdued and his impetuosity restrained so as to fit him for a quiet guide to novices. The art of communicating instruction of whatever kind is much to be valued, and I have ever thought that those who devote themselves to this employment, as do their duty with diligence and success, are entitled to very high respect from the community, as Johnson himself often maintained. Yet, I am of opinion that the greatest abilities are not only not required for this office, but render a man less fit for it. Oh. While we acknowledge the justness of Thomson's beautiful remark, delightful task to rear the tender thought and teach the young idea how to shoot. We must consider that this delight is perceptible only by a mind at ease, a mind at once calm and clear, but that a mind gloomy and impetuous like that of Johnson cannot be fixed for any length of time in minute attention, and must be so frequently irritated by unavoidable slowness and error in the advance of scholars as to perform the duty with little pleasure to the teacher and no great advantage to the pupils. Good temper is a most essential requisite in a preceptor. Horace paints the character as bland. Ut puris olim dant crustula blandae, doctores elementa velint ut dusere prima. As teachers sometimes give little boys cakes to coax them into learning their letters. I understood a little bit of that. I know pueris and crustella. Johnson was not more satisfied with his situation as the master of an academy than with that of the usher of a school. We need not wonder, therefore, that he did not keep his academy above a year and a half. From Mr. Garrick's account, he did not appear to have been profoundly reverenced by his pupils. His oddities of manner, his uncouth gesticulations, could not be but the subject of merriment to them, and in particular the young rogues used to listen at the door of his bedchamber and peep through the keyhole, that they might turn into ridicule his tumultuous and awkward fondness for Mrs. Johnson, oh boy, whom he used to name by the familiar appellations of Teddy or Tetsy, which, like Betsy or Betty, is provincially used as a contraction for Elizabeth, her Christian name, but which to us seems ludicrous when applied to a woman of her age and appearance. Mr. Garrick described her to me as very fat, with a bosom of more than ordinary protuberance, with swelled cheeks of a florid red, produced by thick painting, and increased by the liberal use of cordials, flaring and fantastic in her dress, and affected both in her speech and her general behavior. I have seen Garrick exhibit her by his exquisite talent for mimicry, so as to excite the heartiest bursts of laughter, but he probably, as in the case of in all such preparations, considerably aggravated the picture. Well, I guess I'll end that for today. Well, we had a real good footnote there. That was exciting. Learning about his romantic life. Well, until next time, bye from Boswell.